Let me give you a small introduction. And so last week we stopped 1821. That's when Mexico finally breaks away from Spain. And it's a great transition because by 1820 we have a guy by the name of Moses Austin. So 1820 is still Spain, not quite Mexico yet. And he goes and talks to the Spanish government because this guy wants to move a colony of Anglo into Texas. So Texas right here, all this is Mexico at this time. But then Moses died, and then his son, Stephen Austin, continues the deal with, at that time now, is Mexico. And so the topic today, which a lot of it is going to be on your exam, deals with the Colonization Act. Because Mexico, if you think about when they become independent in 1821, they inherit this huge chunk of land. And a lot of this, we learn that, there's not that many people living in this new frontier. And so Mexico thought it was a great idea to invite Anglo-Americans and also Chinese, no?
Chinese.
You're going to talk about it. So I'm going to let Professor Jacobo, because he wrote a book about it. It's A Stranger Among Us, one of them.
I don't know. Yes, that's one of the ones. Yes.
And
Yes.
so he covers all this. And so that's actually his expertise. So that's why I wanted to invite him to talk to the class. So take good notes if you can. If not, all right.
Let me talk a little bit before we.
Yeah, whatever you want to do.
So, it's one of those things where often I think as historians or as history students, we tend to fail to connect the past to the present, right? And maybe in our daily struggle for survival, we don't look back and see how we got here. But, we live in a space, in a place that was for centuries really seen as a promised land, as a land of opportunity for many different peoples, right? Indeed, I'm not, okay? I was born in 1967, like I told you, 1967. In 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act in the United States, correct, Miss? That was the law that ended legal what? Legal, anybody know? Segregation in the United States, okay? I was born 3 years after the law was passed. So don't ever think, oh, it's un chingo de tiempo, a long time ago. This is very, in a sense, recent. The majority of our history as Americans has some kind of a legal system of segregation. And that was built upon a system that already existed in the Spanish caste system, see? Right? So you're talking about it. It's very difficult to eradicate that kind of mentality, yes? You just cannot say, well, okay, that's gone. It's going to be embedded in your brain, in your institutions, correct? So that's going to permeate as you go forward. So Mexico, again, is independent, but it has these real social fragmentation problems. They're divided as a people. In fact, there are historians, including your own professor, who tell us that they believe that what got Mexico together in terms of nationalism, right, like unity, was a hatred really of the United States. Anti-American sentiment fused Mexican nationalism as a result of this war that we're going to eventually talk about in the next couple of days in class. So you have a country that is fragmented socially. You are broke, right, because you borrow money to fight the United States from France, from England, from Spain, believe it or not, right? And eventually they're going to come and want their money back, okay? And you also are lacking a political experience, right? You have the situation that Mexico had been a part of the Aztec Empire for 300 years, correct? And now you have, after that, followed by another 100 years of Spanish plus control, if you will. There really is no idea of democracy or self-government, right? Or some kind of a different type of a government, if you will, right? So you have those serious problems, right? You have, again, I'll repeat myself, you're broke, fragmented socially, and lacking a political sense of direction. In fact, between the independence of Mexico in 1821 and when the United States, let's be clear, attacked Mexico and the war begins, there were 23 coups d'etats in the Mexican political system. What's a coup d'etat?
It's like a revolt.
Like a revolt, un golpe de Estado, right? So you do not have a lot of political stability if every other year that you have a revolt of some kind, right? So you are, in a sense, weak. Now, you have a lot of also positive things. You are an enormous nation in terms of territory. The American Southwest up to Utah, right? You have Central America, parts of Central America that were part of Mexico. But you have a lot of natural resources, right? It's a wealthy nation in terms of resources. But you do have, again, those previously mentioned problems. And one more that we can add, or maybe two, is that Mexico is highly centralized in terms of its population, right? In other words, most Mexicans live in central Mexico, right? Back then, and to some extent today, I suppose. But back then, for sure, about 90% of the Mexican population back then lived in and around Mexico City. So all of the territories around to the north and south are not very densely populated, and we've already established some of them are people who don't consider themselves to be Mexicans, right? So that's not going to help anyway. Centralism was a huge, huge problem. Now, Professor Gomez was saying to us earlier that there was already an idea with the Spanish about trying to populate the northern territories through perhaps immigration, but it was feared within the monarchy, right? When Mexico becomes independent, they are going to take that aggressive step, right? And there was an authority who passed on, his name was David Weber, who wrote about this. Did you ever take classes with David Weber? You did, huh? He wrote several books on these topics. Anyways, he's the one that tells us, his research, that the law of 1824 was an attempt to, again, populate these northern territories, okay? So by 1824, the Mexican nation thinks, well, we need to begin to do something about this vast northern territories, or we're going to perhaps lose them. Why don't we follow the idea that was already there from before about opening our borders to foreign colonists, but in particular, Americans who also were already in Texas, unauthorized in many cases, and invite them to come into Texas and to settle, okay? The United States was both admired and feared in Mexico, right? And again, we get the name Estados Unidos Mexicanos, right, from the United States of America. So there was some already copying of what that was going on, right, from what the United States model looked like. If you're in Mexico back then, you're looking at the United States as a growing power, politically, economically, and so you are beginning to look at them as a country that you have to perhaps be concerned with, or perhaps again imitate what they're doing because it's growing in a very fast rate. So you have an attraction towards that in some ways, and say, okay, well, we're going to open our borders. It's going to be called the 1824 Colonization Act. 1824 Colonization Act. Okay. And it has three main objectives. The first objective is to populate, right? And you're going to do that by, again, opening your borders to these immigrants. Now, as Professor Gomez was saying, Dr. Weber tells us that the idea had been, and it's sort of a radical idea for its time, to invite Americans into Texas and perhaps attract Chinese immigrants into California. Okay? And the Chinese question is perhaps interesting to you, to all of us, but it makes sense given the history of Spain in Asia, right? Like for example, the Philippines, right? And so there was an attraction there. So the first objective is just open our borders, okay? You alluded to the Austin family, right? And the idea that they were going to come in with a certain number of American families, settle in Mexico, obey Mexican law. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, right? And other conditions, and things will be great. That's the idea. But the first thing is to open up, people come in, you populate. The second objective would be to create, commerce, develop commerce, basically, okay? So it's a good idea if you think about it. You bring in people from Texas, right? Into Texas. And they come from Boston, New York, Louisiana, and they're gonna bring with them their connections, their trade, right? Businesses, not just to Boston and New York, but across the pond to Europe. So the idea was you bring people in, they're gonna bring their networks, right, back for where they come from, and therefore, economically, the Northern Territories will develop. Not just people will be here, but people will also be here with business, money, entrepreneurship, that kind of thing. Make sense? Yeah? Chingon? Right? And the third thing, of course, if that happens, then you're going to incorporate the southern part of Mexico with the northern part of Mexico. Yes? So when you develop the north, the south is already developed. Mexico City has a university from before, right? Cities develop, populations that are centralized. So now you have the south and the north developed, you have a stronger nation. Now, it's kind of interesting because it kind of works in some ways now that it's no longer Mexican territory. You have cities like Los Angeles that perhaps have more Mexicans than Mexican cities, right? Like it's probably the second largest city of Mexicanos, if that makes any sense to you, in Los Angeles, right? You have a lot of economic ties between the U.S. And Mexico, the southwestern, in particular in Mexico. I don't know what the number is now of remesas. Do you know what it is, Profe? But probably like about $30 billion, because back then it was like $24 billion. So about $30 billion around there of money enters the Mexican economy every year from the United States. But the remesas are not from businesses or la mota, back and forth, nothing like that.
Remesas are money that family wired.
Exactly. That's the important thing. It is money that your parents or grandparents send back to their loved ones in Mexico. $30 billion. That's, again, separate from everything else, right? NAFTA, whatever else, you know. And so it's a lot of money that enters Mexico. So the Mexican economy is quite dependent on that money, right? And so I don't know if any of you have family in Mexico. I have, well, people are passing on, unfortunately, like my abuelita, but you know, there's weddings and bautismos and divorcios, and we're always sending money over there for some reason every other month. You know, my dad lives down there, you know, in Guanajuato, so you know, there's money going back and forth. So this is it's interesting how again the past and the present connect in that sense. Back then, the Mexican nation thought we're going to have this master plan of bringing people in, and they're going to develop commerce, and it's going to be great. But it completely backfires, right? For a number of reasons. Okay, so we know now the objectives, right? Why would Americans want to come to Texas, you think? Land. The land was being offered. That was the lure, right? The Mexican government is offering, I think it was 4 pennies an acre, 7 years of no taxation, a lot of guarantees. So land was, of course, the lure. There was also some pressures in the United States back then over land. So the attraction was there to move west, right? But there were some conditions. Has anybody had a chance to read the chapter yet, by any chance? So Mexico says, we're going to open our borders, you can come in, but in return you have to do a couple things. Yeah, please.
They have to learn Spanish.
Okay.
I think it was one of them, and then they have to follow the laws as well.
Follow the laws and?
Catholic.
Uh-huh.
Laws of order.
Become, right on. So you have basically the Mexican government saying, you can come over here, you get all of the land, you get tax breaks, but you have to follow, again, Mexican law. Language is important, sort of culturize yourself, right? But two big ones was you have to become a Mexican citizen, right? And you have to also become a member of the Catholic Church, okay? Now, it is interesting because Mexico is not a theocracy. It's not a state-run religious government kind of thing. It's not. In fact, both the Profe would know more than me on this, but there is really sort of an anti-church sentiment in Mexico, politically speaking, frankly, right? Because the Spanish work together with the Catholic Church more closely.
Maybe you want to explain a little bit that just before or around that time, 1820, you have the secularization of the mission.
Yes. So Mexico was not necessarily, the government of Mexico was not necessarily a friend of the Catholic Church. That's what I would tell you. In fact, they took the land from the churches and gave it to the people. So there was a lot of resentment from the Catholic Church against the Mexican government. The Mexican government now allowed priests to politically speak, about politics, even to wear their attire go in public. It was very interesting. It was the true separation of church and state in that model, right? But now they're saying, well, if you want to come over, though, you got to become Catholic. Why do you think that's the case? Because it seems to me kind of strange that they would ask that. Anybody have an idea of why they would do that? So I did ask David Weber that question. Any thoughts? Well, maybe there will be less tension, perhaps. Maybe that was the idea, if there's a common religion, if people speak language, that kind of thing. And so I think we're trying to diffuse the possible tensions, right? but it's going to backfire for a number of ways. Okay, the 1824 law is going to be very successful. Okay, very successful in that time, in that you're going to have a lot of American immigrants coming into mainly Texas. The Chinese never made it during this time. Okay, but there's going to be a problem with a lot of these immigrants coming from the United States into Texas. Part of the problem is that they came primarily from the American South. Okay, now we can all talk shit about Alabama all we want. Okay, but there's a number of things you can say about the South back then. If you think about time and space, okay, what would be the problem with the American South, please?
Slavery.
Slavery. Okay, so one is they're going to come in with their slaves. Okay, and that's going to make the Mexican people rather uncomfortable because there was, again, experiences, right, that they had themselves as a population with slavery. Also, according to the Mexican Constitution, slavery was already illegal, in Mexico. So it was sort of kind of a weird thing that was taking place, that they came in, brought their slaves, but there began to be also, frankly, a dispute within the Mexicano Tejanos themselves, because the Tejanos themselves were rather, regional, right? And so they were interested in the development of Texas. And some of them thought, well, if we want Texas to grow, it's only going to happen with the Americans. And if we want cotton to be the industry, it's going to require perhaps the variable of slavery. So there was also a dispute within the Tejano Mexicano familias. There's a memoir. Do you remember we used to watch that movie, Juan Seguin? Yeah, back then. So it's based on the memoirs of Juan Seguin, who was the son of Erasmo Seguin, who negotiated with Stephen Austin to bring the first 300 families into near San Antonio, Texas, right? So, at any rate, he wrote about all of these experiences of watching the Americans come in, with the slaves and how they felt rather strange about what they were seeing, type of thing. And there was a lot of problems already because a lot of the runaway slaves from Louisiana run away towards Mexico, right, to escape slavery. So there was already a lot of tension that was there. So it's also going to be a factor, and again, I beg you to think in context, the religion factor, okay? Do you see any problems with that? It's not just they're going to bring in their slaves. What else? What about religion? That might be an issue.
They were Protestant.
We're Protestant, exactly. Okay, so the chapter that you have for this week is super important because it's going to go into depth into why that was a big issue, okay? So again, you and I, a product of perhaps the civil rights of the United States, multiculturalism, pluralism, hopefully we're much more respectful and, if anything, tolerant of other beliefs, correct? When I was in college, I had a roommate that would change religions every other month, depending on who he was dating, and I just thought it was kind of weird, but he did that. But back then, it was going to be a big thing for you to tell a Protestant to become a Catholic, okay? So does anybody have an idea why? What's a little bit deeper into that? If not, the chapter will tell you, will inform you. How was the Catholic Church perceived by the Protestant movement or religious beliefs? Yeah.
Corrupt.
As corrupt, right? As morally corrupt, as politically, socially corrupt. Some of this stuff, it's even heavier than that. The Pope as the Antichrist, right? So you're going to read about this in this important chapter again. For the devil himself, exactly. The armies of the Pope were the armies of Spain, right? I mean, if you are the enemy of Spain, you're going to fear the Catholic Church and its power, correct? And if you are looking at places where the Spanish go, they take with them the Catholic Church, right? San Diego. What's the name of our town here? San Diego, pero aquí chingado, San Marcos, no? San Marcos and San Diego, right? So, I mean, it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Antonio. There's a saint everywhere you go, right? That's the Spanish, and it's what we call the sword and the cross. The sword and the cross working together, But the point is that if you are the enemies of Spain, you fear the Catholic Church because you are perceiving them as being one unit. And in the article that you're going to read, they describe the armies of the Pope as the armies of Spain and vice versa, correct? So again, we're just letting you know that it's not just, it's a different religion, adapted or whatever, that everybody's Christian. No, there was some heavy stuff there that was going to create a problem, okay? And the other thing is that you might think it's easy to say, well, become a citizen, and that's it. I know that I could easily be a citizen of many countries in this world. Costa Rica comes to mind. Okay, but La Bella Colombia con mi compañero, But back then, for you to tell someone that was an American to become a Mexican citizen, could you see any problems with that back then? And if so, what would they be, you think? How were Mexicans seen back then in the United States?
Dirty.
Dirty, okay? Dirty, backward, right? Not half, maybe savage, right? You're going to read a chapter
Golden greasers.
greasers, a very negative stereotype, okay? This particular chapter is going to tell you this, and it's very important because, again, we can learn about the long experience of colonial mentality based on race. So when you read the article, it's going to tell you that the English had a sort of a barometer, we call it that, a sort of a measurement, if you will, of racial purity, correct? So you're going to have, on the one hand, white, blue eye, green eye, and that was seen as beauty, correct? Yes? Okay? It's called the Elizabethan model, right? And on the opposite side, you're going to have what, you think? You're going to have, the opposite of white would be what? Black. And brown, what, you have white and you have black, right? That's the way it was perceived. Again, think in context, right? That was the barometer. And the more you are in this way, you are more racially what? More racially pure, better, right? Think about that when we hear Mexicans say, para que se mejore la raza, right? You ever heard that before in Mexico, right? People say something like that if you marry like a lighter skinned person. And the darker you are, right? You're on that side, right? So Mexicans are not going to be all the way over there. Where are they going to be? Maybe, I won't even say the middle, maybe more like to this side. Right. I'm sorry, I'm out of the camera. Right? But more towards that side. Because why are they towards the bottom of the scale? You're darker, but what do you have besides, what makes you darker?
They're mixed.
Mixed? Andale. So not just the sun, right? But what makes you darker? In fact, the article that you are reading is going to say that there's an anti-Spanish, right, sentiment first. Because the Spanish themselves are not seen as racially pure, because what do the Spanish have, supposedly? Not indigenous yet. They have
In Spain.
Spain.
Spain was invaded by
By whom? Muslims, exactly, right? Exactly. So they're not racially pure anymore. So the Spanish are worked towards the bottom of the scale because they have been affected, impacted by black blood. Again, think about it again in context. Otherwise, you're going to lose. You might be offended or lose the side of the whole argument, right? So the Spanish themselves are towards the bottom of the scale. I know that's a test question. Did you get that? The Spanish are towards the bottom of the scale. Okay, because you think of Spain as being European, correct? And in the model, they're saying no, they are. Aquí viven, they live on here, but they're already not pure than us. So if the Spanish are bad, right, because they're not racially pure, if the Spanish are messed up, I always say, the Mexicans are, don't say it, but think about it, okay? They're even worse, right? Because now what do they have that makes them even worse? Not just Spanish, black ancestry, but they have Muslim and now indigenous ancestry, right? So it's one of those things, again, that you and I perhaps, nowadays don't think about it, but la raza cósmica, my argument comes from this. Your professor is great in Spanish. I'm struggle with both languages, frankly. But when we say phrases like, for example, I'm going to make something now. Ojalá que mañana llueva para tomar chocolate, right? It's a very simple phrase like, hopefully tomorrow will rain so we can have some chocolate, right? In that very simple phrase, what languages do we see, you think? Or what ancestors do you see there? Arabic, right? For example, what was the Arabic in that? Ojalá, right? Which my mother would always say, ojalá te compongas, cabrón. It's like the word ojalá means oh God, oh Allah, right? And then you have llover, and what about, which is Spanish, right? What about chocolate, guajolote, mole, tamal? What are those? What language is that? Now, right? So again, you have a very interesting mixture, right, of all of the ancestry, right, that makes our totality, correct? Again, but these are things that perhaps you and I can celebrate, that we think it's cool. For example, right now, I just did that 23andMe thing. So the point is that, we're part of this cultural, right, hybridity, right? That's why you call it in your class, hybridity. That's his word. This blending of cultures, right? That you and I might think is cool and celebrate, but back then, was it something to celebrate back then? No. It was like, this guy's it's kind of a mutt, He's not a person that is. So it's very difficult for you to be governed by someone that you see as lesser than you. Does that make sense? So here Mexico is saying you have to become citizens, you have to become Catholic, but if you see someone as below you, of a lesser god, of a lesser race, it's going to be very difficult to make that relationship work. And if you add to that what my friend and scholar already said over there, manifest destiny, right? That fact that you think that God is going to give you this land anyways, then you're going to have some serious problem, okay? So we know that by 1829, there was like a 10-to-1 ratio already in Texas, meaning 10 American colonists coming in to every Mexican national who lived in Texas, mainly around San Antonio, okay? And that majority who were the immigrants began to exercise segregation policies on the minority who were the Mexicans,
Yeah.
right?
San Antonio went from a town of 2,000 to 25,000.
Yeah, very fast. And with signs that would say no Mexicans allowed in the store when it was Mexico. So how's that going to make you feel if you're a Mexicano?
Pretty disrespectful.
Mad, disrespected, and thinking, oh shit, what happened here, kind of thing, right? So the same really happened with the government. So now, surprisingly, you see in the Mexican government a response to this, right? You're going to see, there was a study done by a Mexican military officer named Manuel Meriteran, commissioned by the Mexican government to sort of report on what they were seeing in the Northern Territories. Very alarming. So you see a drastic change in Mexican policy from colonial legislation to open the borders and let people in to trying to control the problems, right? And you have all this in your literature. You have it also in your lectures, videos that we have recorded.
Video, yeah.
Yeah. So we have, for example, Mexico responds by saying in 1829, well, guess what? No more slaves, no more slavery in Mexican territory of any kind, right? So that's our very first attempt to control the American colonists. Say, okay, if you do not like it here, you're going to have to go back home, to where you came from with your slaves. The response by the majority of slave owners was to free their slaves and to sign them into long life contracts of work as workers, not as slaves. Similar experience, but to circumvent, of course, again, Mexican law. But it created a lot of tension between the Texas American colonists and the Mexican government, who are now, they perceive the Mexican government as being authoritarian, anti-laissez-faire, right, anti-free enterprise, controlling, backward of sorts, sort of proving what you're going to read what's called the black legend in your literature, right, leyenda negra. And then finally in 1830, you're going to have the Mexican government taking a very interesting step in making it illegal, basically, to have Americans enter Mexican territory with the law of April 6, 1830. So they shut the border down, right? Now, do you think that they were successful in stopping immigration from the United States? Nope, no more than we are today, right? Americans continue to enter Mexican territory unauthorized, amongst them members of what became the Mormon Church in Utah, for example, right? And it was really futile, frankly, to try to stop the flow, given the different motives and things that were going on. And all of this, of course, is adding more and more tension in Mexico and with the United States, eventually leading to even more drastic policies like centralism by Presidente Antonio López de Santana, and eventually it will lead to what your professor, I'm sure, will cover is the Texas conflict, right, of 1836, as finally, if you will, the Mexican government decides that it's going to try to punish, if you will, the American colonists in Texas for the rebellion, for their attitudes, and that leads to the famous Alamo, right, campaign, and leads eventually, years later, to the Mexican-American War. it's an interesting history, again, if you look at it, and what we want to put again in your mind is that even though often I think we don't appreciate the study of history, because people just think it's the study of the past, but there's so many more things. It's really anthropology, sociology, right, politics, really the study in this case of race and racism, right? So all of that is important to, somebody's phone's going out, maybe it's yours. No, not yours. But it's something that we want to invite you to think about, right, that would happen back then.